In June 1462, Sultan Mehmed II stopped his army. This was the man who had conquered Constantinople 9 years earlier, the man who had shattered the walls that had stood for 1,000 years, the conqueror who had crushed Serbian despots, Albanian rebels, and Hungarian crusaders. But now, on the road to the Wallachian capital of Targovishte, Mehmed's 60,000-strong army came to a halt. Before them stretched what chroniclers would call the forest of the impaled, a nightmare made real. 20,000 corpses, maybe more, mounted on wooden stakes that stretched for miles along both sides of the road. Turkish soldiers captured in raids, Bulgarian villagers, men, women, children. Some had been there for weeks, their bodies rotting in the summer heat. Others were fresh, still dying slowly in agony. The Sultan himself felt his stomach turn. According to Turkish chronicles, Mehmed said, "How can I deprive of his country a man who does such great things? A man who uses his power like this is worthy of more." But he didn't say it in admiration. He said it in horror. This was psychological warfare perfected. This was terror as military strategy. This was the handiwork of one man. Vlad III of Wallachia, the Impaler, Dracula. You know the name from vampire stories, from Gothic novels and Hollywood films. The undead count in his Transylvanian castle, drinking blood and fearing the cross. But the real Vlad Dracula was far more terrifying than any fictional vampire, because he was real, because he actually did these things, and because, in his own twisted way, it worked. This is the story of how a traumatized boy became history's most infamous monster, how impalement became state policy, how one man's brutality saved his country from conquest, and how a medieval warlord transformed into an immortal legend. You'll discover why Vlad chose impalement over every other form of execution. You'll understand the strategic genius behind the night attack that almost killed a sultan. You'll learn how German propaganda turned him into Dracula the Devil. And you'll see how Romania transformed their most brutal ruler into a national hero. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about Vlad the Impaler. He wasn't insane. Every act of horror served a purpose. Every forest of corpses sent a message. Every impaled body was a calculation. The question is whether the end justified the means. Let's find out. To understand Vlad the Impaler, you need to understand where he came from. And it starts with a kingdom caught between empires. Wallachia in the early 15th century was what we'd call a geopolitical nightmare. A small Orthodox Christian principality squeezed between three superpowers. The Kingdom of Hungary to the north and west, the Ottoman Empire to the south and east, and the vast steppes controlled by various Tatar hordes to the northeast. Imagine trying to govern a country where survival meant playing all three sides against each other, where one wrong move meant invasion, where showing weakness to any neighbor meant destruction. That was the world Vlad's father inherited. Vlad the Sioux, known as Dracul, meaning the dragon, became Prince of Wallachia in 1436. The name came from his membership in the Order of the Dragon, a Catholic crusading order. But in Romanian, Dracul also means the devil. His son, Vlad III, was thus Dracula, son of the dragon or son of the devil, depending on who you asked. Vlad Dracula was born in 1431, probably in the Transylvanian fortress town of Sighișoara. He had two older brothers, Mircea and Radu, and for his first decade of life, things were relatively normal for a medieval prince. Then came 1442, and his childhood ended. His father, desperate to maintain Ottoman support against Hungarian pressure, made a deal with Sultan Murad II. As guarantee of Wallachia's loyalty, Vlad Dracul would send his two youngest sons, 11-year-old Vlad and 7-year-old Radu, to the Ottoman court as hostages. Think about that for a moment. You're 11 years old, you're Christian, and your own father sends you to live with the Muslim empire that is actively conquering Christian lands. The boys were taken to Edirne, then the Ottoman capital. And here's where Vlad's psychology was forged. The Ottomans didn't mistreat the boys in the traditional sense. They weren't tortured or imprisoned. Instead, they were educated. They learned Turkish, Persian, Arabic. They studied the Quran, Islamic law, mathematics, philosophy. They were trained in horsemanship, archery, and swordsmanship, alongside the elite Janissary Corps. But Vlad never forgot that he was a hostage, a prisoner, no matter how gilded the cage. Radu, the younger brother, adapted. He embraced Ottoman culture, became friends with the young Prince Mehmed, and would later convert to Islam. But Vlad resisted. Every lesson in submission bred deeper resentment. Every day in captivity hardened something inside him. Then, in 1447, disaster struck. News reached the brothers that their father and eldest brother Mircea had been killed in Wallachia, not by Ottomans, not by Hungarians, but by their own people, Wallachian nobles backed by Hungary who saw Vlad Dracula as too pro-Ottoman. The details were horrific. Vlad Dracula was buried alive. Mircea had his eyes gouged out before being buried alive himself. The Donetsk family, rival claimants to the throne, had orchestrated the whole thing with Hungarian support. Imagine being 16 years old, a hostage in a foreign empire, and learning that your father and brother were brutally murdered by your own countrymen. This is the wound that never healed. This is what turned Vlad into the impaler. Because now he knew the truth. In Wallachia, showing mercy meant death. Trusting nobles meant betrayal. Following rules meant weakness. The only thing that mattered was fear. Vlad got his first chance at the Wallachian throne in 1448, at just 17 years old. The Ottomans, who still held him, and his brother saw an opportunity to install a pro-Ottoman prince while Sultan Murad II was at war with Hungary. They gave Vlad an army and sent him north. His first reign lasted 2 months, just 60 days before the Hungarian-backed Vladislav II returned and drove him out. But those 2 months taught Vlad another lesson. Power without absolute control is worthless. He spent the next 8 years in exile, moving between Moldavia and Transylvania, building alliances, gathering supporters, and planning his return. And the whole time, he was learning, studying, waiting. In 1456, while Hungary was celebrating its great victory over Mehmed II at Belgrade, Vlad saw his chance. With Hungary distracted and Vladislav II weakened, Vlad struck. According to legend, he challenged Vladislav to single combat outside Targoviste. Whether that's true or not, the result was clear. Vladislav died, and Vlad entered the capital in August 1456 as Prince of Wallachia for the second time. He was 25 years old, and he had learned exactly what kind of ruler he needed to be. Within weeks, he began consolidating power by appointing loyal followers to high offices and confiscating the wealth of boyars, the noble class, who had supported previous regimes. But that was just administrative housekeeping. What came next was a statement. Easter Sunday, 1457. The Wallachian nobles and their families gathered at Targoviste for the traditional Easter feast. 200 guests, maybe more. The richest and most powerful families in the country, dressed in their finest clothes, celebrating the holiest day in the Orthodox calendar. Vlad was hosting. Midway through the banquet, Vlad stood and delivered a speech. He asked a simple question. How many princes have you seen rule Wallachia in your lifetimes? The older nobles boasted. 7 princes, 10 princes. Some claim to have outlasted a dozen rulers, watching princes rise and fall like the seasons. Vlad smiled. Then he gave the order. Guards seized every guest. Every man, woman, and child. Anyone old enough to have participated in the murder of Vlad's father and brother was immediately executed, but not quickly, not mercifully. They were impaled. Some sources say the impalements happened right there, in view of the Easter feast. Others say they were marched outside the city. Either way, the message was crystal clear. The younger nobles and their families, those who were innocent of his family's murder but still complicit, through their noble blood, received a different punishment. Vlad marched them 50 miles north in their Easter finery, no food, no rest, to the ruins of Poyanari Castle. There, he forced them to rebuild the fortress stone by stone. Many died from exhaustion. Their fine clothes rotted off their bodies as they worked. When Poyanari was finished, it became Vlad's personal fortress, his escape route, his final redoubt, built with the blood of the nobility that had killed his family. The Easter Massacre did something remarkable. It decapitated the Wallachian noble class in a single day. The old families, with their private armies and independent power, were gone. In their place, Vlad appointed new men, loyal men, men who owed everything to him and would lose everything if he fell. For the first time in decades, Wallachia had a prince who didn't have to negotiate with nobles, who didn't have to balance factions, who ruled through absolute terror. But impalement wasn't just about revenge. It was a system, a policy, and Vlad was just getting started. Let's talk about impalement, because if we're going to understand Vlad, we need to understand why he chose this specific method of execution. Medieval Europe had no shortage of brutal execution methods. Hanging, beheading, burning at the stake, breaking on the wheel, drawing, and quartering. But Vlad chose impalement, and he chose it deliberately. Impalement is designed to maximize suffering and visibility. A sharpened wooden stake is inserted through the body, usually through the rectum or genitals, and the victim is hoisted upright. If done correctly, the stake misses vital organs. The victim can live for hours, sometimes days, slowly sliding down the stake from their own weight. It's public, it's visible from a distance, it's impossible to ignore, and it sends a very specific message. This is what happens to enemies of Vlad. But here's what makes Vlad different from other brutal rulers. He industrialized it. He turned impalement into state policy, applied systematically to enforce order. Merchants who cheated customers, impaled. Thieves, impaled. Corrupt officials, impaled. Foreign ambassadors who didn't show proper respect, sometimes impaled. Women accused of adultery, impaled. Beggars and the chronically poor, seen as drains on society, rounded up and impaled en masse. There's a famous story, possibly apocryphal but telling nonetheless. Vlad supposedly left a golden cup by a public fountain in Târgoviște. It sat there for years, and nobody dared steal it, because everyone knew what would happen. This is terror as governance. Crime rates in Wallachia during Vlad's reign were reportedly non-existent, not because people became moral, but because the cost of any transgression was so horrific that nobody risked it. Contemporary accounts describe forests of impaled corpses outside every major town. The German pamphlets that would later demonize Vlad claimed he impaled thousands at a time, then dined among the corpses. Whether that specific detail is true or propaganda, it tells you how his reputation had spread. But the psychology goes deeper. Vlad understood something that modern counterinsurgency warfare would later prove. Fear is force multiplication. If your enemy believes you're capable of anything, you don't need a large army. You don't need expensive fortifications. You just need a reputation. When Ottoman raiders crossed the Danube, they didn't find armies waiting. They found stakes. Hundreds of them. Thousands of them. Turkish prisoners from previous raids, impaled and left to rot as warnings. The psychological effect was devastating. Ottoman soldiers began deserting rather than face the impaler. Vlad also understood that impalement served another purpose. It bought time. A traditional execution is quick. The victim dies, and that's the end. But impalement takes hours or days. During that time, the victim screams. They beg. They're visible to everyone. It's a deterrent that keeps working long after the sentence is carried out. And here's the darkest part. It worked. During Vlad's reign, Wallachia was more stable than it had been in decades. The constant civil wars between noble factions stopped. The betrayals and assassinations that had killed his father and brother didn't happen to him. The boyars were too terrified to plot. But there's a cost to ruling through terror. You can never show weakness. You can never show mercy, because the moment you do, the spell breaks, and you make enemies, powerful enemies. By 1461, Vlad had been paying annual tribute to Sultan Mehmed II to maintain peace, but Vlad's raids into Ottoman territory and his refusal to pay the promised 1,000 boys for the Janissary Corps had created friction. Then Vlad made his move. Hamza Pasha, the Ottoman governor of Nicopolis, arrived in Wallachia with an official delegation to collect the overdue tribute and the boys. But his secret mission, discovered by Vlad's extensive spy network, was to kidnap Vlad and bring him to Constantinople for punishment. Vlad found out, and Vlad didn't negotiate. He ambushed the entire delegation outside Targovishte. Hamza Pasha and his officers were captured, and then, in full view of any remaining Ottoman soldiers, Vlad had them impaled. Hamza himself got the tallest stake, a sign of his rank. This was a declaration of war. In the winter of 1462, while Mehmed's armies were still in distant Anatolia, Vlad launched one of the most brutal military campaigns in European history. He crossed the frozen Danube with his army and invaded Ottoman Bulgaria. What happened next was systematic genocide. Village after village burned. Every Turkish and Bulgarian civilian found was impaled. No prisoners, no mercy, no exceptions. In a letter to Matthias Corvinus, the king of Hungary, Vlad boasted of his body count. He claimed to have killed 23,884 Turks and Bulgarians, not in battle, in massacres. The letter listed the dead by category: men, women, children. Why did he do this? 2 reasons. First, to provoke Mehmed into invading Wallachia, where Vlad could fight a defensive guerrilla war on his own terms. Second, to make the cost of that invasion so psychologically devastating that Ottoman morale would collapse. Mehmed took the bait. Enraged, the Sultan assembled the largest Ottoman army seen since the siege of Constantinople and marched north in April 1462. 60 to 80,000 men, plus a fleet of 170 ships. The full force of the Ottoman war machine coming for Vlad. And Vlad had maybe 20,000 men, mostly peasant levies. Any sane ruler would have sued for peace, would have offered tribute, hostages, territory, anything to avoid annihilation. But Vlad wasn't sane, not anymore, and he had a plan. As Mehmed's massive army crossed the Danube and marched north toward Targovishte, they entered a nightmare. Vlad had implemented a scorched earth policy. Every village along the Ottoman line of march was abandoned and burned. Wells were poisoned with corpses and lime. Livestock was slaughtered and left to rot. Crops were set on fire. Anything the Ottomans could use was destroyed. The Sultan's 70,000-man army marched through a wasteland. No food, no clean water, no shelter. And in the forests and marshes around them, Wallachian light cavalry launched constant hit-and-run attacks. Arrows from the tree line, ambushes at river crossings, night raids on camps. The Ottomans couldn't catch them, couldn't force a battle, could only keep marching north through the devastation, losing men to disease, thirst, and guerrilla attacks. Then they reached the forest of the impaled. 20,000 corpses, the bodies of Turkish soldiers captured in Vlad's winter raids, the bodies of Bulgarian civilians, all impaled and arranged in a macabre display stretching for miles. Ottoman morale shattered. These were professional soldiers who had stormed Constantinople, who had fought in a dozen campaigns, but nothing had prepared them for this. The smell alone was overwhelming. The sight was worse. According to the chronicles, even Mehmed, who had seen plenty of violence, was shaken. This wasn't warfare. This was psychological terrorism elevated to an art form. But Vlad wasn't done, because the forest of stakes was just the setup for his masterpiece. On the night of June 16, 1462, Vlad launched what historians call the night attack. He had spent the previous day disguised as a Turkish merchant, infiltrating the Ottoman camp to locate Mehmed's tent. Now, with that intelligence, he assembled a strike force of 7,000 to 10,000 men with a single mission: kill the Sultan. At 11 p.m., with torches blazing and war horns blaring, Vlad's cavalry smashed into the Ottoman camp from multiple directions. Wallachian soldiers dressed in captured Turkish armor and uniforms added to the confusion, shouting orders in Turkish, causing Ottoman soldiers to attack each other in the darkness. Chaos, complete chaos. Tents, burning, men fighting shadows, no one knowing who was friend or enemy. Vlad personally led a group driving toward Mehmed's tent. He got close, desperately close. But in the confusion and darkness, he ended up at the tent of the Grand Vizier Mahmud Pasha, who wasn't there. Mehmed himself, protected by his elite Janissaries, survived untouched. As dawn approached and the Janissaries stabilized the situation, Vlad withdrew. The night attack had failed in its primary objective. Mehmed was alive, but the psychological damage was done. The Ottoman army had been humiliated. Mehmed himself had been targeted in his own camp, and estimates put Ottoman casualties at 5,000 to 10,000 compared to about 1,000 Wallachians. 2 weeks later, when the exhausted Ottoman army finally reached Târgoviște, they found the city abandoned. Vlad and the population had fled to the mountains, and waiting for them outside the capital was the final horror. Another forest of impaled corpses, this one topped by the rotting body of Hamza Pasha on the highest stake. Mehmed had had enough. He installed Vlad's younger brother Radu as the new prince of Wallachia, left him with Ottoman troops, and retreated south. The Sultan had won territorially. Wallachia was now firmly under Ottoman control. But Vlad had won psychologically. One man with 20,000 troops had traumatized an army of 70,000, had fought the conqueror of Constantinople to a standstill, had almost killed a sultan. Through sheer, unrelenting horror, Vlad had proved that terror could challenge empires, but it couldn't last forever. After the Ottoman invasion, Vlad's support in Wallachia collapsed. The boyars, the merchants, the common people, everyone had suffered too much. The scorched earth, the constant war, the endless impalements. They were exhausted. Radu, Vlad's younger brother, offered something Vlad never could: peace, stability, an end to the horror. One by one, Wallachian towns opened their gates to Radu and the Ottomans. Vlad fled north to Hungary, expecting support from King Matthias Corvinus. After all, Vlad had been fighting the Ottomans, Hungary's enemy. Surely the king would help. Instead, Matthias arrested him. Why? Politics. Matthias had received money from the Pope to fund a crusade against the Ottomans, but he'd spent it on other wars. Arresting Vlad as a dangerous war criminal gave him an excuse for why the crusade never happened. I would have fought the Turks, but I was busy dealing with this madman. Vlad spent the next 12 to 13 years imprisoned in a castle near Visegrad, Hungary. From 1462 to 1475, the impaler sat in a cell. But this is where something fascinating happened. While Vlad was imprisoned, his legend exploded across Europe. German printing presses, a relatively new technology, churned out pamphlets about Vlad's atrocities. These weren't objective historical accounts. They were propaganda, designed to sell copies through sensationalism. The pamphlets had titles like The Story of a Bloodthirsty Madman Called Dracula. They contained lurid woodcut illustrations showing Vlad dining among forests of impaled victims, Vlad impaling women through the breast, Vlad roasting children and forcing their mothers to eat them. Some of these stories were based on real events, exaggerated for effect. Others were complete fabrications. But it didn't matter. The pamphlets spread across German-speaking Europe, and Dracula the Devil became synonymous with evil incarnate. This was character assassination on a mass scale, and it worked. For centuries, Western Europe would remember Vlad only as a monster. But in Wallachia and later Romania, something different was happening. By 1476, Vlad was released from prison, probably because Hungary needed him again to counter Ottoman influence in Wallachia. With Hungarian and Moldavian support, Vlad reclaimed his throne for a third time. His third reign lasted mere months. In December 1476 or January 1477, Vlad was killed in battle, or possibly assassinated by Turkish agents. The details are murky. His head was cut off and sent to Mehmed II as proof of death. The Sultan had it mounted on a stake in Constantinople. Even in death, Vlad was impaled. He was about 45 years old, and by any measure, his life was a failure. His reign lasted only about 6 years total across 3 separate periods. Wallachia remained under Ottoman domination. His scorched earth tactics left the country devastated. He died without achieving his goal of true independence. But the legend was just beginning. Over the centuries, Romanian historians and folklorists began rehabilitating Vlad's image. They emphasized his resistance to the Ottomans, his defense of Christian Europe, his attempts to strengthen Wallachia against foreign powers. The impalement and terror were reframed as necessary evils, harsh but effective methods to defend a small nation against overwhelming threats. By the 19th century, during the Romanian national awakening, Vlad had been transformed into a national hero, a symbol of resistance against foreign domination, a ruler who, whatever his methods, put his country first. Then, in 1897, an Irish writer named Bram Stoker published a novel called Dracula. Stoker borrowed the name and a few historical details: Vlad's Transylvanian connections, his association with the Order of the Dragon, his reputation for cruelty. But Stoker's Count Dracula was a completely different creature, an undead vampire, supernatural, evil personified, living in a Gothic castle and drinking blood. The novel became a global phenomenon, and the name Dracula became forever associated with vampires rather than impalement. It's a strange immortality. The real Vlad, the traumatized hostage, the brutal warlord, the desperate defender, has been overshadowed by a fictional vampire who bears his name but little else. Today, if you visit Romania, you'll find Vlad everywhere. His face on tourist merchandise, his castles preserved as monuments, his story told as national pride. He's on stamps, statues, even a theme park. And if you visit Transylvania, you'll find Dracula tours and Dracula hotels, blending the historical Vlad with Stoker's vampire into a single profitable mythology. So what do we make of Vlad the Impaler? Was he a hero or a monster? The honest answer is both, and neither. He was a product of his time and circumstances, a child traumatized by captivity and his family's murder, a prince who learned that mercy meant death and terror meant survival. A military leader who understood that psychological warfare could multiply force. His methods were horrific by any standard. The impalements, the massacres, the systematic use of terror, these aren't defensible, no matter the strategic justification. Thousands of innocents died horrible deaths to serve his political goals. But he also fought against impossible odds. A small principality between empires, surrounded by enemies, betrayed by its own nobility. Vlad kept Wallachia independent longer than anyone expected. He bloodied the Ottoman Empire enough that they remembered him for generations. The question isn't whether Vlad was good or evil. It's whether we can understand how someone becomes capable of such horror, and what it says about us that we've turned him into entertainment. Because here's the final irony. Vlad wanted to be feared in life so his enemies would leave Wallachia alone. He failed. Wallachia fell to Ottoman control anyway. But, in death, he achieved a different kind of immortality. Not as a conqueror or a saint, but as something more powerful. A symbol. A warning. A dark mirror reflecting the capacity for cruelty that exists in all of us when we decide the ends justify any means. The impaler's shadow is long. 500 years later, we're still standing in it. And that's the story of Vlad Dracula. From traumatized hostage to brutal warlord to immortal legend. If you made it this far, thank you. Genuinely. These deep dives take time to research and write, and knowing people actually watch to the end makes it worthwhile. If this scratched that dark history itch, subscribe for more stories like this. Next time, we're looking at another figure who turned cruelty into policy, and whether medieval justice was ever really just. Drop a comment. Did Vlad's methods work? Was the terror justified to defend Wallachia? Or is there a line that can't be crossed, no matter the stakes? Until next time, remember, monsters are rarely as simple as the legends suggest.